राजा हिंदुस्तानी 1996 में बनी धर्मेश दर्शन द्वारा निर्देशित हिंदी भाषा की प्रेम कहानी फिल्म है। आमिर खान और करिश्मा कपूर द्वारा प्रमुख भूमिका निभाई गई है। 15 नवंबर 1996 को जारी ये फिल्म 1965 के जब जब फूल खिले की रीमेक है, जिसमें शशि कपूर और नंदा कलाकार हैं। फिल्म का संगीत नदीम श्रवण द्वारा दिया गया था, जिसमें समीर के बोल थे। जारी होने के बाद ये वर्ष की सबसे ज्यादा कमाई करने वाली फिल्म बनी। इसने 7 स्टार स्क्रीन पुरस्कार सहित 5 फिल्म फेयर पुरस्कार जीते थे। राजा हिंदुस्तानी आमिर खान एक युवा व्यक्ति है जो टैक्सी चालक पर्यटक गाइड के रूप में काम करता है। आरती सहगल करिश्मा कपूर एक अमीर लड़की है जो अपने अतीत से जुड़ने की कोशिश कर रही है। श्री सहगल सुरेश ओबेरॉय अपनी पुत्री आरती और उसकी सौतेली मां शालिनी अर्चना पूरण सिंह के साथ एक भव्य महल घर में रहते हैं। आरती अपनी मृत मां की यादों को खोजने के लिए पालानेत नाम के एक छोटे पहाड़ी शहर में छुट्टी के लिए जाने का फैसला करती है। आगमन पर उसे पता चलता है कि उसके पास हवाई अड्डे से पालानेत तक कोई परिवहन नहीं है, इसलिए वह इकलौते उपलब्ध ड्राइवर राजा हिंदुस्तानी की सेवाएं लेती है। पालानेत में आरती और राजा रहने के दौरान घुल मिल जाते हैं और आखिर में प्यार में पड़ जाते हैं। एक दिन आरती के पिता पालानेत में आते हैं और उसको उनके साथ घर चलने की कहते हैं। आरती अपने पिता को राजा के बारे में बताती हैं, लेकिन श्री सहगल रिश्ते से इनकार कर देते हैं। आरती राजा को चुनती है, लेकिन अपने पिता से आशीर्वाद मांगती है। उसके पिता अपना आशीर्वाद दिए बिना मुंबई के लिए रवाना हो जाते हैं। कुछ समय बाद श्री सहगल अपनी बेटी को माफ कर देते हैं और पालानेत में जाते हैं। वहां वह अपनी बेटी और दामाद को एक नया घर देते हैं। राजा घर में रहने से इनकार कर देता है क्योंकि वह इसे उपहार के रूप में नहीं देखता है, बल्कि दान के रूप में देखता है, क्योंकि वह गरीब है और श्री सहगल समृद्ध है। शालिनी, उसके भाई स्वराज, प्रमोद मुथु और उनके भतीजे जय मोहनीश बहल श्री सहगल की संपत्तियों का पूरा नियंत्रण पाने के लिए इस संघर्ष का फायदा उठाने की कोशिश करते हैं। आमिर खान का जन्म 14 मार्च 1965 को मुंबई में हुआ था। उनके पिता का नाम ताहिर हुसैन और उनकी मां का नाम जीनत हुसैन है। आमिर खान के एक भाई भी हैं जिनका नाम फैजल खान है। आमिर खान की बहनों का नाम फरहत खान और निखत खान है। उनके परिवार के कई सदस्य फिल्म इंडस्ट्री से जुड़े रहे हैं। उनके पिता ताहिर हुसैन फिल्म निर्माता थे। उनके अंकल नासिर हुसैन निर्माता निर्देशक थे। उनके भांजे इमरान खान भी मौजूदा वक्त में हिंदी फिल्म इंडस्ट्री के अभिनेता हैं। आमिर खान की शुरुआती पढ़ाई बी पेटिट स्कूल से हुई थी। इसके बाद 8वीं कक्षा तक वे सेंट एनी हाई स्कूल में पढ़े और 9वीं और 10वीं कक्षा की पढ़ाई बॉम्बे स्कॉटिश स्कूल माहिम से की। उन्होंने 12वीं कक्षा की पढ़ाई नारसी मुंजी कॉलेज से पूरी की।
A tattoo is a form of body modification where a design is made by inserting ink, dyes and pigments, either indelible or temporary, into the dermis layer of the skin to change the pigment. The art of making tattoos is tattooing. Tattoos fall into 3 broad categories: purely decorative, with no specific meaning; symbolic, with a specific meaning pertinent to the wearer; and pictorial, a depiction of a specific person or item. In addition, tattoos can be used for identification, such as ear tattoos on livestock as a form of branding. 1. Contents. 1. Terminology. 2 types. 2.1 Traumatic tattoos. 2.2 Subcultural connotations. 2.3 Identification. 2.4 Cosmetic. 2.5 Functional. 2.6 Medical. 3 History. 3.1 Europe. 3.2 America. 3.2.1 Protection Papers. 3.2.2 Freedom Papers. 3.3 Australia. 4 Process. 5 Stencil and Hectograph. 6 Equipment. 7 Practice Regulation and Health Risk Certification. 8 Associations. 8.1 Historical Associations. 8.2 Modern Associations. 9 Advertising and Marketing. 10 Health Risks. 11 Removal. 12 Temporary Tattoos. 12.1 Types of Temporary Tattoos. 12.1.1 Decal style temporary tattoos. 12.1.2 Metallic jewelry tattoos. 12.1.3 Airbrush temporary tattoos. 12.1.4 Henna temporary tattoos. 12.2 Temporary tattoo safety. 12.2.1 Decal style temporary tattoo safety. 12.2.2 Airbrush tattoo safety. 12.2.3 Henna tattoo safety. 13 Religious views. 14 In popular culture. 15 See also. 15.1 Styles. 15.2 Location. 15.3 Others. 16 References. 16.1 Citations. 16.2 Sources. 17 External links. Terminology. Spanish depiction of the tattoos, Patik, of the Visayan Pintados, the painted ones, of the Philippines in the Boxer Codex, circa 1590, one of the earliest depictions of native Austronesian tattoos by European explorers. A Maori chief with tattoos, Moko, seen by Cook and his crew, circa 1769. The word tattoo, or tatau in the 18th century, is a loan word from the Samoan word tata, meaning to strike. 2-3, the Oxford English Dictionary gives the etymology of tattoo as in 18th c. Tatau, tatau. From Polynesian, Samoan, Tahitian, Tongan, etc., tata. In Marquesan, tattoo. Before the importation of the Polynesian word, the practice of tattooing had been described in the West as painting, scarring or staining. 4. The etymology of the body modification term is not to be confused with the origins of the word for the military drumbeat or performance, see military tattoo. In this case, the English word tattoo is derived from the Dutch word tapto. 5. Copyrighted tattoo designs that are mass-produced and sent to tattoo artists are known as flash, a notable instance of industrial design. 6. Flash sheets are prominently displayed in many tattoo parlors for the purpose of providing both inspiration and ready-made tattoo images to customers. The Japanese word irizumi means insertion of ink and can mean tattoos using tabari, the traditional Japanese hand method, a Western-style machine or any method of tattooing using insertion of ink. The most common word used for traditional Japanese tattoo designs is horimino. 7. Japanese may use the word tattoo to mean non-Japanese styles of tattooing. British anthropologist Lingroth in 1900 described 4 methods of skin marking and suggested they be differentiated under the names tattoo, moko, cicatrix and keloid. 8. The first is by pricking that leaves the skin smooth, as found in places including the Pacific Islands. The second a tattoo combined with chiseling to leave furrows in the skin, as found in places including New Zealand. The third is scarification using a knife or chisel, as found in places including West Africa, and the fourth is scarification by irritating and reopening a pre-existing wound, rescarification, to form a raised scar, as found in places including Tasmania, Australia, Melanesia, and Central Africa. 9. Implicit in the classification was an evolutionary development from the most primitive form of body modification, the last, to the most sophisticated, the first. 9. Types. The American Academy of Dermatology distinguishes 5 types of tattoos. 10. Traumatic tattoos, also called natural tattoos, that result from injuries, especially asphalt from road injuries or pencil lead. Amateur tattoos, professional tattoos, both via traditional methods and modern tattoo machines. Cosmetic tattoos, also known as permanent makeup, and medical tattoos. Traumatic tattoos. A traumatic tattoo occurs when a substance such as asphalt or gunpowder is rubbed into a wound as the result of some kind of accident or trauma. 11. Coal miners could develop characteristic tattoos owing to coal dust getting into wounds. 12. These are particularly difficult to remove as they tend to be spread across several layers of skin, and scarring or permanent discoloration is almost unavoidable depending on the location. An amalgam tattoo is when amalgam particles are implanted into the soft tissues of the mouth, usually the gums, during dental filling placement or removal. 13. Another example of such accidental tattoos is the result of a deliberate or accidental stabbing with a pencil or pen, leaving graphite or ink beneath the skin. Subcultural connotations. Tattooing among women of the Khoita people of Papua New Guinea traditionally began at age 5 and was added to each year, with a V-shaped tattoo on the chest indicating that she had reached marriageable age. Photo taken in 1912. Many tattoos serve as rites of passage, marks of status and rank, symbols of religious and spiritual devotion, decorations for bravery, sexual lures and marks of fertility, pledges of love, amulets and talismans, protection, and as punishment, like the marks of outcasts, slaves and convicts. The symbolism and impact of tattoos varies in different places and cultures. Tattoos may show how a person feels about a relative, commonly mother, father or daughter, son, or about an unrelated person. 14. Today, people choose to be tattooed for artistic, cosmetic, sentimental, memorial, religious, and magical reasons, and to symbolize their belonging to or identification with particular groups, including criminal gangs, see criminal tattoos, or a particular ethnic group or law-abiding subculture. Popular texts include the biblical verses John 3:16, Philippians 4:13, and Psalm 23. 15. Extensive decorative tattooing is common among members of traditional freak shows and by performance artists who follow in their tradition. 16. Identification. An identification tattoo on a survivor of the Auschwitz concentration camp. People throughout history have also been forcibly tattooed for means of identification. A well-known example is the Nazi practice of forcibly tattooing concentration camp inmates with identification numbers during the Holocaust as part of the Nazis' identification system, beginning in fall 1941. 17. The SS introduced the practice at Auschwitz concentration camp in order to identify the bodies of registered prisoners in the concentration camps. During registration, guards would pierce the outlines of the serial number digits onto the prisoners' arms. Of the Nazi concentration camps, only Auschwitz put tattoos on inmates. 18. The tattoo was the prisoner's camp number, sometimes with a special symbol added. Some Jews had a triangle, and Romani had the letter C, from German Zigeuner for gypsy. In May 1944, Jewish men received the letters A or B to indicate a particular series of numbers. Tattoos have also been used for identification in other ways. As early as the Zhou, Chinese authorities would employ facial tattoos as a punishment for certain crimes or to mark prisoners or slaves. During the Roman Empire, gladiators and slaves were tattooed, exported slaves were tattooed with the words tax paid, and it was a common practice to tattoo fugitive, denoted by the letters FUG, on the foreheads of runaway slaves. 19. Owing to the biblical strictures against the practice, 20 Emperor Constantine I banned tattooing the face around AD 330, and the Second Council of Nicaea banned all body markings as a pagan practice in AD 787. 21. In the period of early contact between the Maori and Europeans, the Maori people hunted and decapitated each other for their moko tattoos, which they traded for European items including axes and firearms. 22. Moko tattoos were facial designs worn to indicate lineage, social position, and status within the tribe. The tattoo art was a sacred marker of identity among the Maori and also referred to as a vehicle for storing one's tapu, or spiritual being, in the afterlife. 23. Tattoo marking a deserter from the British Army, skin removed post-mortem. Tattoos are sometimes used by forensic pathologists to help them identify burned, putrefied, or mutilated bodies. As tattoo pigment lies encapsulated deep in the skin, tattoos are not easily destroyed even when the skin is burned. 24. Tattoos are also placed on animals, though rarely for decorative reasons. Pets, show animals, thoroughbred horses, and livestock are sometimes tattooed with identification and other marks. Tattooing with a slap mark on the shoulder or on the ear is the standard identification method in commercial pig farming. Branding is used for similar reasons and is often performed without anesthesia, but is different from tattooing as no ink or dye is inserted during the process, the mark instead being caused by permanent scarring of the skin. 25. Pet dogs and cats are sometimes tattooed with the serial number, usually in the ear, or on the inner thigh, via which their owners can be identified. However, the use of a microchip has become an increasingly popular choice and since 2016 is a legal requirement for all 8.5 million pet dogs in the UK. 26. Tattooed lip makeup. Cosmetic. Main article, permanent makeup. Permanent makeup is the use of tattoos to enhance eyebrows, lips, liner and/or lipstick, eyes, liner, and even moles, usually with natural colors, as the designs are intended to resemble makeup. 27. A growing trend in the US and UK is to place artistic tattoos over the surgical scars of a mastectomy. More women are choosing not to reconstruct after a mastectomy and tattoo over the scar tissue instead. The mastectomy tattoo will become just another option for post-cancer patients and a truly personal way of regaining control over post-cancer bodies. 28. However, the tattooing of nipples on reconstructed breasts remains in high demand. 29. Functional. Functional tattoos are used primarily for a purpose other than aesthetics. One such use is to tattoo Alzheimer patients with their names, so they may be easily identified if they go missing. 30. Medical. Main article, medical tattoo. Medical tattoo. Blood type. Medical tattoos are used to ensure instruments are properly located for repeated application of radiotherapy and for the areola in some forms of breast reconstruction. Tattooing has also been used to convey medical information about the wearer, for example, blood group, medical condition, etc. Additionally, tattoos are used in skin tones to cover vitiligo, a skin pigmentation disorder. 31. SS blood group tattoos, German, Blutgruppentatouierung, were worn by members of the Waffen-SS in Nazi Germany during World War II to identify the individual's blood type. After the war, the tattoo was taken to be prima facie, if not perfect, evidence of being part of the Waffen-SS, leading to potential arrest and prosecution. This led a number of ex-Waffen-SS to shoot themselves through the arm with a gun, removing the tattoo and leaving scars like the ones resulting from pox inoculation, making the removal less obvious. 32. Tattoos were probably also used in ancient medicine as part of the treatment of the patient. In 1898, Daniel Fkay, a medical doctor, wrote an article on medical tattooing practices in ancient Egypt, in which he describes the tattooed markings on the female mummies found at the Deir el-Bahari site. He speculated that the tattoos and other scarifications observed on the bodies may have served a medicinal or therapeutic purpose. The examination of these scars, some white, others blue, leaves in no doubt that they are not, in essence, ornament, but an established treatment for a condition of the pelvis, very probably chronic pelvic peritonitis. 33. History. Main article, History of Tattooing. Samoan Pia, Traditional Male Tattoos. Wayad, the last Mambabatak, traditional Kalinga tattooist, of the Kalinga in the Philippines, performing a traditional Batek tattoo. Preserved tattoos on ancient mummified human remains reveal that tattooing has been practiced throughout the world for many centuries. 34. In 2015, scientific reassessment of the age of the two oldest known tattooed mummies identified Itzy as the oldest example then known. This body, with 61 tattoos, was found embedded in glacial ice in the Alps, and was dated to 3250 BCE. 34-35, in 2018, the oldest figurative tattoos in the world were discovered on two mummies from Egypt which are dated between 3351 and 3017 BCE. 36. Ancient tattooing was most widely practiced among the Austronesian people. It was one of the early technologies developed by the Proto-Austronesians in Taiwan and coastal South China prior to at least 1500 BCE, before the Austronesian expansion into the islands of the Indo-Pacific. 37-38, it may have originally been associated with headhunting. 39, tattooing traditions, including facial tattooing, can be found among all Austronesian subgroups, including Taiwanese Aborigines, Islander Southeast Asians, Micronesians, Polynesians, and the Malagasy people. Austronesians used the characteristic hafted skin puncturing technique, using a small mallet and a piercing implement made from citrus thorns, fishbone, bone, and oyster shells. 238-40. Ancient tattooing traditions have also been documented among Papuans and Melanesians, with their use of distinctive obsidian skin piercers. Some archaeological sites with these implements are associated with the Austronesian migration into Papua New Guinea and Melanesia. But other sites are older than the Austronesian expansion, being dated to around 1650 to 2000 BCE, suggesting that there was a pre-existing tattooing tradition in the region. 38. Among other ethno-linguistic groups, tattooing was also practiced among the Ainu people of Japan, some Austroasians of Indochina, Berber women of Tamazga, North Africa. 41, the Yoruba, Fulani and Hausa people of Nigeria. 42, Native Americans of the pre-Columbian Americas. 43, and Picts of Iron Age Britain. 44. Europe. In 1565, French sailors abducted from Canada an Inuit woman with facial tattoos and her daughter. They put them on public display in Antwerp, the Netherlands, drawing crowds for money. 45, Sir Martin Frobisher, an English privateer, also abducted an Inuit man from Baffin Island, putting him on display in London before he died from European diseases. Frobisher returned to Baffin Island and abducted a man, a woman, and a child, also taking them back to London for public display. They also died from illness shortly afterwards. 46. Giolo, real name Jelly, of Myangas, who became a slave in Mindanao, and bought by William Dampier together with Jelly's mother, who died at sea. Jelly was exhibited in London in 1691 for money as a one-man human zoo, until he died of smallpox 3 months later. 47. Perhaps the most famous tattooed curiosity in Europe prior to the voyages of Captain Cook, was the Painted Prince, a slave named Jolly from Mindanao, Philippines. He was initially bought with his mother, who died shortly afterwards, from a slave trader in Myangas Island in 1690 by the English explorer William Dampier. Dampier described Jolly's intricate tattoos in his journals. 48. He was painted all down the breast, between his shoulders, behind, on his thighs, mostly, before, and the form of several broad rings, or bracelets around his arms and legs. I cannot liken the drawings to any figure of animals, or the like, but they were very curious, full of great variety of lines, flourishes, checkered work, and keeping a very graceful proportion, and appearing very artificial, even to wonder, especially that upon and between his shoulder blades. I understood that the painting was done in the same manner as the Jerusalem cross is made in men's arms, by pricking the skin, and rubbing in a pigment. William Dampier, A New Voyage Around the World, 1697. Jolly told Dampier that he was the son of a Raja in Mindanao, and told him that gold, bulawan, abounded in his island. These were likely embellishments told by Jolly in an effort to convince Dampier to free him. He also mentions that the men and women of Mindanao were also tattooed similarly, and that his tattoos were done by one of his 5 wives. 48. He is believed to be a Visayan Pintado, if he indeed came from Mindanao. Other authors have also identified him as Pala, and due to the pattern of his tattoos and his account that he was tattooed by women, Visayan tattooists were male from the few surviving records, while Pala and tattooists were female, although this would conflict with his own admission that he originally came from Mindanao. 49. Dampier brought Jolly with him to London, intending him to be a puppet prince for the British venture into the Spice Islands. He promised Jolly that he would be paid well and allowed to return home. He invented a fictional backstory for him, renaming him Prince Giolo and claiming that he was the son and heir of the King of Jalilo. Instead of being from Mindanao, Dampier now claimed that he was only shipwrecked in Mindanao with his mother and sister, whereupon he was captured and sold to slavery. Dampier also claimed that Jolly's tattoos were created from an herbal paint that rendered him invulnerable to snake venom, and that the royal tattooing process was done naked in a room of venomous snakes. 4850. Dampier initially toured around with Jolly, showing his tattoos to crowds. Despite pretending to care for the prince, Dampier eventually sold Jolly to the Blue Boar Inn in Fleet Street. Jolly was displayed as a sideshow by the inn, with his likeness printed on playbills and flyers advertising his exquisitely painted body. By this time, Jolly had contracted smallpox and was very ill. He was later brought to the University of Oxford for examination, but he died shortly afterwards at around 30 years of age in the summer of 1692. His tattooed skin was preserved and was displayed in the Anatomy School of Oxford for a time, although it was lost prior to the 20th century. 4850-51. A portrait of Aamir, a tattooed Rayatan man brought back to Europe by James Cook. It is commonly held that the modern popularity of tattooing stems from Captain James Cook's 3 voyages to the South Pacific in the late 18th century. Certainly, Cook's voyages and the dissemination of the texts and images from them brought more awareness about tattooing, and, as noted above, imported the word tattoo into Western languages. 52. On Cook's first voyage in 1768, his science officer and expedition botanist, Sir Joseph Banks, as well as artist Sidney Parkinson and many others of the crew, returned to England with a keen interest in with Banks writing about them extensively. 53, and Parkinson is believed to have gotten a tattoo himself in Tahiti. 54, Banks was a highly regarded member of the English aristocracy that had acquired his position with Cook by co-financing the expedition with £10,000, a very large sum at the time. In turn, Cook brought back with him a tattooed Rayatan man, Omai, whom he presented to King George in the English court. On subsequent voyages other crew members, from officers, such as American John Ledyard, to ordinary seamen, were tattooed. 55. The first documented professional tattooist in Britain was Sutherland MacDonald, who operated out of a salon in London beginning in 1894. 56. In Britain, tattooing was still largely associated with sailors. 57, and the lower or even criminal class. 58. But by the 1870s had become fashionable among some members of the upper classes, including royalty. 459, and in its upmarket form it could be an expensive 60, and sometimes painful 61, process. A marked class division on the acceptability of the practice continued for some time in Britain. 62. Recently, a trend has arisen marketed as stick and poke tattooing. Simple designs are tattooed either on oneself or by another person using DIY kits that usually contain needles, ink, and often sample designs. 63. America. As most tattoos in the United States were done by Polynesian and Japanese amateurs, tattoo artists were in great demand in port cities all over the world, especially by European and American sailors. The first recorded professional tattoo artist in the U.S. was a German immigrant, Martin Hildebrandt. He opened a shop in New York City in 1846 and quickly became popular during the American Civil War among soldiers and sailors of both Union and Confederate militaries. Hildebrandt began traveling from camp to tattoo soldiers, increasing his popularity and also giving birth to the tradition of getting tattoos while being an American serviceman. Soon after the Civil War, tattoos became fashionable among upper-class young adults. This trend lasted until the beginning of World War I. The invention of the electric tattoo machine caused popularity of tattoos among the wealthy to drop off. The machine made the tattooing procedure both much easier and cheaper, thus, eliminating the status symbol tattoos previously held, as they were now affordable for all socioeconomic classes. The status symbol of a tattoo shifted from a representation of wealth to a mark typically seen on rebels and criminals. Despite this change, tattoos remained popular among military servicemen, a tradition that continues today. In 1975, there were only 40 tattoo artists in the country. In 1980, there were more than 5,000 self-proclaimed tattoo artists, citation needed, appearing in response to booming popularity in the skin mural trade. 64. Many studies have been done of the tattooed population and society's view of tattoos. In June 2006, the Journal of the American Academy of Dermatology published the results of a telephone survey of 2004. It found that 36% of Americans ages 18 to 29, 24% of those 30 to 40, and 15% of those 41 to 51 had a tattoo. 65. In September 2006, the Pew Research Center conducted a telephone survey that found that 36% of Americans ages 18 to 25, 40% of those 26 to 40 and 10% of those 41 to 64 had a tattoo. They concluded that Generation X and Millennials express themselves through their appearance, and tattoos are a popular form of self-expression. 66. In January 2008, a survey conducted online by Harris Interactive estimated that 14% of all adults in the United States have a tattoo, slightly down from 2003, when 16% had a tattoo. Among age groups, 9% of those ages 18 to 24, 32% of those 25 to 29, 25% of those 30 to 39 and 12% of those 40 to 49 have tattoos, as do 8% of those 50 to 64. Men are slightly more likely to have a tattoo than women. Sailor being tattooed by fellow sailor aboard USS New Jersey in 1944. Richmond, Virginia has been cited as one of the most tattooed cities in the United States. 67, that distinction led the Valentine Richmond History Center to create an online exhibit titled History, Inc., the Tattoo Archive Project. The introduction to the exhibit notes, in the past, Western culture associated tattoos with those individuals who lived on the edge of society. However, today they are recognized as a legitimate art form and widely accepted in mainstream culture. Since the 1970s, tattoos have become a mainstream part of Western fashion, common among all genders, to all economic classes 68, and to age groups from the later teen years to middle age. For many young Americans, the tattoo has taken on a decidedly different meaning than for previous generations. The tattoo has undergone dramatic redefinition and has shifted from a form of deviance to an acceptable form of expression. 69. As of November 1, 2006, Oklahoma became the last state to legalize tattooing, having banned it since 1963. 70. Protection papers. Protection papers were used by American sailors to prevent themselves from being taken off American ships and impressed into the Royal Navy. These were simple documents that describe the sailor as being an American sailor. Many of the protection certificates were so general, and it was so easy to abuse the system, that many impressment officers of the Royal Navy paid no attention to them. In applying for a duplicate Seaman's Protection Certificate in 1817, James Francis stated that he had a protection granted him by the collector of this port on or about March 12, 1806, which was torn up and destroyed by a British captain when at sea. 71. One way of making them more specific was to describe a tattoo, which is highly personal, and thus use that description to identify the seaman. As a result, many of the later certificates carried information about tattoos and scars, as well as other specific information. This also perhaps led to an increase and proliferation of tattoos among American seamen. Frequently their protection papers made reference to tattoos, clear evidence that individual was a seafaring man. Rarely did members of the general public adorn themselves with tattoos. 72. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, tattoos were as much about self-expression as they were about having a unique way to identify a sailor's body should he be lost at sea or impressed by the British Navy. The best source for early American tattoos is the protection papers issued following a 1796 congressional act to safeguard American seamen from impressment. These proto-passports cataloged tattoos alongside birthmarks, scars, race, and height. Using simple techniques and tools, tattoo artists in the early republic typically worked on board ships using anything available as pigments, even gunpowder and urine. Men marked their arms and hands with initials of themselves and loved ones, significant dates, symbols of the seafaring life, liberty poles, crucifixes, and other symbols. 73. Freedom papers. Because these protection papers were used to define freemen and citizenship, many black sailors and other men also used them to show that they were freemen if they were stopped by officials or slave catchers. They also called them free papers because they certified their non-slave status. Many of the freed blacks used descriptions of tattoos for identification purposes on their freedom papers. 74. Australia. Fred Harris, Tattoo Studio, Sydney, 1937. Branding was used by European authorities for marking criminals throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. 75. The practice was also used by British authorities to mark army deserters and military personnel court-martialed in Australia. In 19th century Australia, tattoos were generally the result of personal rather than official decisions, but British authorities started to record tattoos along with scars and other bodily markings to describe and manage convicts assigned for transportation. 76. The practice of tattooing appears to have been a largely non-commercial enterprise during the convict period in Australia. For example, James Ross in the Hobart Almanac of 1833 describes how the convicts on board ship commonly spent time tattooing themselves with gunpowder. 76. By the beginning of the 20th century, there were tattoo studios in Australia, but they do not appear to have been numerous. For example, the Sydney tattoo studio of Fred Harris was touted as being the only tattoo studio in Sydney between 1916 and 1943. 77. Tattoo designs often reflected the culture of the day, and in 1923 Harris's small parlor experienced an increase in the number of women getting tattoos. Another popular trend was for women to have their legs tattooed so the designs could be seen through their stockings. 78. By 1937 Harris was one of Sydney's best-known tattoo artists and was inking around 2,000 tattoos a year in his shop. Sailors provided most of the canvases for his work, but among the more popular tattoos in 1938 were Australian flags and kangaroos for sailors of the visiting American fleet. 79. Process. Main articles: Process of tattooing and tattooing. File Man getting a tattoo.ogv. Man getting a tattoo. Tattooing involves the placement of pigment into the skin's dermis, the layer of dermal tissue underlying the epidermis. After initial injection, pigment is dispersed throughout a homogenized damaged layer down through the epidermis and upper dermis, in both of which the presence of foreign material activates the immune system's phagocytes to engulf the pigment particles. As healing proceeds, the damaged epidermis flakes away, eliminating surface pigment, while deeper in the skin granulation tissue forms, which is later converted to connective tissue by collagen growth. This mends the upper dermis, where pigment remains trapped within successive generations of macrophages, ultimately concentrating in a layer just below the dermis, epidermis boundary. Its presence there is stable, but in the long term, decades, the pigment tends to migrate deeper into the dermis, accounting for the degraded detail of old tattoos. 80. Stencil and hectograph. In modern tattooing, an artist may use a thermal stencil paper or hectograph to first place the design print on the skin before working with a machine and needle on skin. This process has enabled artists to create very detailed artworks on the skin. Equipment. A two-coil tattoo machine. Some tribal cultures traditionally created tattoos by cutting designs into the skin and rubbing the resulting wound with ink, ashes or other agents. Some cultures continue this practice, which may be an adjunct to scarification. Some cultures create tattooed marks by hand tapping the ink into the skin using sharpened sticks or animal bones, made into needles, with clay-formed discs or, in modern times, actual needles. The most common method of tattooing in modern times is the electric tattoo machine, which inserts ink into the skin via a single needle or a group of needles that are soldered onto a bar, which is attached to an oscillating unit. The unit rapidly and repeatedly drives the needles in and out of the skin, usually 80 to 150 times a second. The needles are single-use needles that come packaged individually. Practice regulation and health risk certification. Tattooing is regulated in many countries because of the associated health risks to client and practitioner, specifically local infections and virus transmission. Disposable plastic aprons and eye protection can be worn depending on the risk of blood or other secretions splashing into the eyes or clothing of the tattooist. Hand hygiene, assessment of risks and appropriate disposal of all sharp objects and materials contaminated with blood are crucial areas. The tattoo artist must wash his or her hands and must also wash the area that will be tattooed. Gloves must be worn at all times and the wound must be wiped frequently with a wet disposable towel of some kind. All equipment must be sterilized in a certified autoclave before and after every use. It is good practice to provide clients with a printed consent form that outlines risks and complications as well as instructions for aftercare. 81. Associations. Historical associations. See also, Religious Perspectives on Tattooing. Mrs. M. Stevens Wagner with Arms and Chest Covered in Tattoos, 1907. Among Austronesian societies, tattoos had various function. Among men, they were strongly linked to the widespread practice of head-hunting raids. In head-hunting societies, like the Ifugao and Dayak people, tattoos were records of how many heads the warriors had taken in battle, and was part of the initiation rites into adulthood. The number, design, and location of tattoos, therefore, were indicative of a warrior's status and prowess. They were also regarded as magical wards against various dangers like evil spirits and illnesses. 82. Among the Visayans of the pre-colonial Philippines, tattoos were worn by the Tamao nobility and the Tamawa warrior class as permanent records of their participation and conduct in maritime raids known as Mangay-a. 83-84. In Austronesian women, like the facial tattoos among the women of the Til and Maori people, they were indicators of status, skill, and beauty. 85-86. An 1888 Japanese woodblock print of a prostitute biting her handkerchief in pain as her arm is tattooed. Based on historical practice, the tattoo is likely the name of her lover. The government of Meiji Japan had outlawed tattoos in the 19th century, a prohibition that stood for 70 years before being repealed in 1948. 87. As of June 6, 2012, all new tattoos are forbidden for employees of the city of Osaka. Existing tattoos are required to be covered with proper clothing. The regulations were added to Osaka's ethical codes, and employees with tattoos were encouraged to have them removed. This was done because of the strong connection of tattoos with the Yakuza, or Japanese organized crime, after an Osaka official in February 2012 threatened a school child by showing his tattoo. Tattoos had negative connotations in historical China, where criminals often had been marked by tattooing. 88-89. The association of tattoos with criminals was transmitted from China to influence Japan. 88. Today, tattoos have remained a taboo in Chinese society. 90. The Romans tattooed criminals and slaves, and in the 19th century released U.S. convicts, Australian convicts and British Army deserters were identified by tattoos. Prisoners in Nazi concentration camps were tattooed with an identification number. Today, many prison inmates still tattoo themselves as an indication of time spent in prison. 4. Native Americans also use tattoos to represent their tribe. Catholic Croats of Bosnia used religious Christian tattooing, especially of children and women, for protection against conversion to Islam during the Ottoman rule in the Balkans. 91. Modern associations. Wilfred Darome Tattoo Collection, 1925. Tattoos are strongly empirically associated with deviance, personality disorders and criminality. 92-93. Although the general acceptance of tattoos is on the rise in Western society, they still carry a heavy stigma among certain social groups. 94. Tattoos are generally considered an important part of the culture of the Russian mafia. 95. Latin King's gang member showing his gang tattoo. Current cultural understandings of tattoos in Europe and North America have been greatly influenced by long-standing stereotypes based on deviant social groups in the 19th and 20th centuries. Particularly in North America, tattoos have been associated with stereotypes, folklore and racism. 23. Not until the 1960s and 1970s did people associate tattoos with such societal outcasts as bikers and prisoners. 96. Today, in the United States, many prisoners and criminal gangs use distinctive tattoos to indicate facts about their criminal behavior, prison sentences and organizational affiliation. 97. A teardrop tattoo, for example, can be symbolic of murder, or each tear represents the death of a friend. At the same time, members of the U.S. military have an equally well-established and long-standing history of tattooing to indicate military units, battles, kills, etc., an association that remains widespread among older Americans. In Japan, tattoos are associated with Yakuza criminal groups, but there are non-Yakuza groups such as Fukushima Seiki's Tattoo Association that sought to preserve the skins of dead Japanese who have extensive tattoos. Tattooing is also common in the British Armed Forces. Depending on vocation, tattoos are accepted in a number of professions in America. Companies across many fields are increasingly focused on diversity and inclusion. 98. Mainstream art galleries hold exhibitions of both conventional and custom tattoo designs, such as Beyond Skin, at the Museum of Croydon. 99. In Britain, there is evidence of women with tattoos, concealed by their clothing, throughout the 20th century, and records of women tattooists such as Jessie Knight from the 1920s. 100. A study of at-risk, as defined by school absenteeism and truancy, adolescent girls showed a positive correlation between body modification and negative feelings towards the body and low self-esteem. However, the study also demonstrated that a strong motive for body modification is the search for self and attempts to attain mastery and control over the body in an age of increasing alienation. 101. The prevalence of women in the tattoo industry in the 21st century, along with larger numbers of women bearing tattoos, appears to be changing negative perceptions. In Covered in Ink by Beverly U. and Thompson, she interviews heavily tattooed women in Washington, Miami, Orlando, Houston, Long Beach, and Seattle from 2007 to 2010 using participant observation and in-depth interviews of 70 women. Younger generations are typically more unbothered by heavily tattooed women, while older generation including the participants' parents are more likely to look down on them. Some even go to the extreme of disowning their children for getting tattoos. 102. Typically how the family reacts is an indicator of their relationship in general. Family members who weren't accepting of tattoos often wanted to scrub the images off, pour holy water on them or have them surgically removed. Families who were emotionally accepting of their family members were able to maintain close bonds after tattooing. 103. Advertising and marketing. Former sailor Roland Hussey Macy, who formed Macy's department stores, used a red star tattoo that he had on his hand for the store's logo. 104. Tattoos have also been used in marketing and advertising, with companies paying people to have logos of brands like HBO, Red Bull, Assos.com and Sailor Jerry's rum tattooed in their bodies. 105. This practice is known as skinvertising. 106. BT's Smokehouse, a barbecue restaurant located in Massachusetts, offered customers free meals for life if they had the logo of the establishment tattooed on a visible part of their bodies. 9 people took the business up on the offer. 107. A financial crisis is any of a broad variety of situations in which some financial assets suddenly lose a large part of their nominal value. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, many financial crises were associated with banking panics, and many recessions coincided with these panics. Other situations that are often called financial crises include stock market crashes and the bursting of other financial bubbles, currency crises, and sovereign defaults. 1-2. Financial crises directly result in a loss of paper wealth but do not necessarily result in significant changes in the real economy, for example the crisis resulting from the famous tulip mania bubble in the 17th century. Many economists have offered theories about how financial crises develop and how they could be prevented. There is no consensus, however, and financial crises continue to occur from time to time. Contents. 1. Types. 1.1 Banking crisis. 1.2 Currency crisis. 1.3 Speculative bubbles and crashes. 1.4 International financial crisis. 1.5 Wider economic crisis. 2 Causes and consequences. 2.1 Strategic complementarities in financial markets. 2.2 Leverage. 2.3 Asset-liability mismatch. 2.4 Uncertainty and herd behavior. 2.5 Regulatory failures. 2.6 Contagion. 2.7 Recessionary effects. 3 Theories. 3.1 Austrian theories. 3.2 Marxist theories. 3.3 Minsky's theory. 3.4 Coordination games. 3.5 Herding models and learning models. 4 History. 4.1 Prior to 19th century. 4.2 19th century. 4.3 20th century. 4.4 21st century. 5 See also. 6 Literature. 6.1 General perspectives. 6.2 Banking crises. 6.3 Bubbles and crashes. 6.4 International financial crises. 6.5 The Great Depression and earlier banking crises. 6.6 Recent international financial crises. 6.7 2007 to 2012 financial crisis. 7 References. 8 External links. Types. Banking crisis. Main article, Bank run. When a bank suffers a sudden rush of withdrawals by depositors, this is called a bank run. Since banks lend out most of the cash they receive in deposits, see fractional reserve banking, it is difficult for them to quickly pay back all deposits if these are suddenly demanded, so a run renders the bank insolvent, causing customers to lose their deposits, to the extent that they are not covered by deposit insurance. An event in which bank runs are widespread is called a systemic banking crisis or banking panic. 3. Examples of bank runs include the run on the Bank of the United States in 1931 and the run on Northern Rock in 2007. 4. Banking crises generally occur after periods of risky lending and resulting loan defaults. Currency crisis. Main article, Currency crisis. See also, hyperinflation. A currency crisis, also called a devaluation crisis, 5, is normally considered as part of a financial crisis. Kaminsky et al. 1998, for instance, define currency crises as occurring when a weighted average of monthly percentage depreciations in the exchange rate and monthly percentage declines in exchange reserves exceeds its mean by more than 3 standard deviations. Frankel and Rose, 1996, define a currency crisis as a nominal depreciation of a currency of at least 25%, but it is also defined as at least a 10% increase in the rate of depreciation. In general, a currency crisis can be defined as a situation when the participants in an exchange market come to recognize that a pegged exchange rate is about to fail, causing speculation against the peg that hastens the failure and forces a devaluation. 5. Speculative bubbles and crashes. Main articles: economic bubble, irrational exuberance, credit cycle, credit crunch, and liquidity crisis. See also, diamond rush, gold rush, oil boom, list of commodity booms, Minsky moment, real estate bubble, stock market bubble, and stock market crash. A speculative bubble exists in the event of large, sustained overpricing of some class of assets. 6. One factor that frequently contributes to a bubble is the presence of buyers who purchase an asset based solely on the expectation that they can later resell it at a higher price, rather than calculating the income it will generate in the future. If there is a bubble, there is also a risk of a crash in asset prices. Market participants will go on buying only as long as they expect others to buy, and when many decide to sell, the price will fall. However, it is difficult to predict whether an asset's price actually equals its fundamental value, so it is hard to detect bubbles reliably. Some economists insist that bubbles never or almost never occur. 7. Black Friday, May 9, 1873, Vienna Stock Exchange. The Panic of 1873 and Long Depression followed. Well-known examples of bubbles, or purported bubbles, and crashes in stock prices and other asset prices include the 17th-century Dutch tulip mania, the 18th-century South Sea bubble, the Wall Street crash of 1929, the Japanese property bubble of the 1980s, the crash of the dot-com bubble in 2000 to 2001, and the now deflating United States housing bubble. 8-9, the 2000s sparked a real estate bubble where housing prices were increasing significantly as an asset good. 10. International financial crisis. Main articles: currency crisis, debt crisis, and sovereign default. When a country that maintains a fixed exchange rate is suddenly forced to devalue its currency due to accruing an unsustainable current account deficit, this is called a currency crisis or balance of payments crisis. When a country fails to pay back its sovereign debt, this is called a sovereign default. While devaluation and default could both be voluntary decisions of the government, they are often perceived to be the involuntary results of a change in investor sentiment that leads to a sudden stop in capital inflows or a sudden increase in capital flight. Several currencies that formed part of the European exchange rate mechanism suffered crises in 1992–93 and were forced to devalue or withdraw from the mechanism. Another round of currency crises took place in Asia in 1997–98. Many Latin American countries defaulted on their debt in the early 1980s. The 1998 Russian financial crisis resulted in a devaluation of the ruble and default on Russian government bonds. Wider economic crisis. Main articles: recession and depression, economics. Negative GDP growth lasting 2 or more quarters is called a recession. An especially prolonged or severe recession may be called a depression, while a long period of slow but not necessarily negative growth is sometimes called economic stagnation. Declining consumer spending. Some economists argue that many recessions have been caused in large part by financial crises. One important example is the Great Depression, which was preceded in many countries by bank runs and stock market crashes. The subprime mortgage crisis and the bursting of other real estate bubbles around the world also led to recession in the US and a number of other countries in late 2008 and 2009. Some economists argue that financial crises are caused by recessions instead of the other way around, and that even where a financial crisis is the initial shock that sets off a recession, other factors may be more important in prolonging the recession. In particular, Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz argued that the initial economic decline associated with the crash of 1929 and the bank panics of the 1930s would not have turned into a prolonged depression if it had not been reinforced by monetary policy mistakes on the part of the Federal Reserve. 11. A position supported by Ben Bernanke. 12. Causes and consequences. Strategic complementarities in financial markets. Main articles: Strategic complementarity and self-fulfilling prophecy. It is often observed that successful investment requires each investor in a financial market to guess what other investors will do. George Soros has called this need to guess the intentions of others reflexivity. 13. Similarly, John Maynard Keynes compared financial markets to a beauty contest game in which each participant tries to predict which model other participants will consider most beautiful. 14. Furthermore, in many cases investors have incentives to coordinate their choices. For example, someone who thinks other investors want to buy lots of Japanese yen may expect the yen to rise in value, and therefore has an incentive to buy yen too. Likewise, a depositor in IndyMac Bank who expects other depositors to withdraw their funds may expect the bank to fail, and therefore has an incentive to withdraw too. Economists call an incentive to mimic the strategies of others strategic complementarity. 15. It has been argued that if people or firms have a sufficiently strong incentive to do the same thing they expect others to do, then self-fulfilling prophecies may occur. 16. For example, if investors expect the value of the yen to rise, this may cause its value to rise. If depositors expect a bank to fail, this may cause it to fail. 17. Therefore, financial crises are sometimes viewed as a vicious circle in which investors shun some institution or asset because they expect others to do so. 18. Leverage. Main article: Leverage, Finance. Leverage, which means borrowing to finance investments, is frequently cited as a contributor to financial crises. When a financial institution, or an individual, only invests its own money, it can, in the very worst case, lose its own money. But when it borrows in order to invest more, it can potentially earn more from its investment, but it can also lose more than all it has. Therefore, leverage magnifies the potential returns from investment, but also creates a risk of bankruptcy. Since bankruptcy means that a firm fails to honor all its promised payments to other firms, it may spread financial troubles from one firm to another. See contagion below. The average degree of leverage in the economy often rises prior to a financial crisis. Citation needed: for example, borrowing to finance investment in the stock market, margin buying, became increasingly common prior to the Wall Street crash of 1929. Asset-liability mismatch. Main article: Asset-liability mismatch. Another factor believed to contribute to financial crises is asset-liability mismatch, a situation in which the risks associated with an institution's debts and assets are not appropriately aligned. For example, commercial banks offer deposit accounts which can be withdrawn at any time, and they use the proceeds to make long-term loans to businesses and homeowners. The mismatch between the bank's short-term liabilities, its deposits, and its long-term assets, its loans, is seen as one of the reasons bank runs occur. When depositors panic and decide to withdraw their funds more quickly than the bank can get back the proceeds of its loans. 17. Likewise, Bear Stearns failed in 2007-08 because it was unable to renew the short-term debt it used to finance long-term investments in mortgage securities. In an international context, many emerging market governments are unable to sell bonds denominated in their own currencies, and therefore sell bonds denominated in US dollars instead. This generates a mismatch between the currency denomination of their liabilities, their bonds, and their assets, their local tax revenues, so that they run a risk of sovereign default due to fluctuations in exchange rates. 19. Uncertainty and herd behavior. Main articles: Behavioral Economics and Herd Behavior. Many analyses of financial crises emphasize the role of investment mistakes caused by lack of knowledge or the imperfections of human reasoning. Behavioral finance studies errors in economic and quantitative reasoning. Psychologist Torbjørn K. Eliassen has also analyzed failures of economic reasoning in his concept of ecopathy. 20. Historians, notably Charles P. Kindleberger, have pointed out that crises often follow soon after major financial or technical innovations that present investors with new types of financial opportunities, which he called displacements of investors' expectations. 21-22. Early examples include the South Sea Bubble and Mississippi Bubble of 1720, which occurred when the notion of investment in shares of company stock was itself new and unfamiliar. 23, and the crash of 1929, which followed the introduction of new electrical and transportation technologies. 24. More recently, many financial crises followed changes in the investment environment brought about by financial deregulation, and the crash of the dot-com bubble in 2001 arguably began with irrational exuberance about Internet technology. 25. Unfamiliarity with recent technical and financial innovations may help explain how investors sometimes grossly overestimate asset values. Also, if the first investors in a new class of assets, for example, stock in dot-com companies, profit from rising asset values as other investors learn about the innovation, in our example, as others learn about the potential of the Internet, then still more others may follow their example, driving the price even higher as they rush to buy in hopes of similar profits. If such herd behavior causes prices to spiral up far above the true value of the assets, a crash may become inevitable. If for any reason the price briefly falls, so that investors realize that further gains are not assured, then the spiral may go into reverse, with price decreases causing a rush of sales, reinforcing the decrease in prices. Regulatory failures. Main articles: Financial regulation and bank regulation. Governments have attempted to eliminate or mitigate financial crises by regulating the financial sector. One major goal of regulation is transparency, making institutions' financial situations publicly known by requiring regular reporting under standardized accounting procedures. Another goal of regulation is making sure institutions have sufficient assets to meet their contractual obligations, through reserve requirements, capital requirements, and other limits on leverage. Some financial crises have been blamed on insufficient regulation, and have led to changes in regulation in order to avoid a repeat. For example, the former managing director of the International Monetary Fund, Dominique Strauss-Kahn, has blamed the financial crisis of 2007 to 2008 on regulatory failure to guard against excessive risk-taking in the financial system, especially in the U.S. 26. Likewise, the New York Times singled out the deregulation of credit default swaps as a cause of the crisis. 27. However, Excessive regulation has also been cited as a possible cause of financial crises. In particular, the Basel II Accord has been criticized for requiring banks to increase their capital when risks rise, which might cause them to decrease lending precisely when capital is scarce, potentially aggravating a financial crisis. 28. International regulatory convergence has been interpreted in terms of regulatory herding, deepening market herding, discussed above, and so increasing systemic risk. 29-30. From this perspective, maintaining diverse regulatory regimes would be a safeguard. Fraud has played a role in the collapse of some financial institutions, when companies have attracted depositors with misleading claims about their investment strategies, or have embezzled the resulting income. Examples include Charles Ponzi's scam in early 20th century Boston, the collapse of the MMM investment fund in Russia in 1994, the scams that led to the Albanian lottery uprising of 1997, and the collapse of Madoff Investment Securities in 2008. Many rogue traders that have caused large losses at financial institutions have been accused of acting fraudulently in order to hide their trades. Fraud in mortgage financing has also been cited as one possible cause of the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis. Government officials stated on September 23, 2008 that the FBI was looking into possible fraud by mortgage financing companies Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, Lehman Brothers, and insurer American International Group. 31. Likewise, it has been argued that many financial companies failed in the recent crisis. Which recent crisis? Because their managers failed to carry out their fiduciary duties. 32. Contagion. Main articles: Financial contagion and systemic risk. Contagion refers to the idea that financial crises may spread from one institution to another, as when a bank run spreads from a few banks to many others, or from one country to another, as when currency crises, sovereign defaults, or stock market crashes spread across countries. When the failure of one particular financial institution threatens the stability of many other institutions, this is called systemic risk. 29. One widely cited example of contagion was the spread of the Thai crisis in 1997 to other countries like South Korea. However, economists often debate whether observing crises in many countries around the same time is truly caused by contagion from one market to another, or whether it is instead caused by similar underlying problems that would have affected each country individually even in the absence of international linkages. Recessionary effects. Some financial crises have little effect outside of the financial sector, like the Wall Street crash of 1987, but other crises are believed to have played a role in decreasing growth in the rest of the economy. There are many theories why a financial crisis could have a recessionary effect on the rest of the economy. These theoretical ideas include the financial accelerator, flight to quality and flight to liquidity, and the Kitaki-Moore model. Some third-generation models of currency crises explore how currency crises and banking crises together can cause recessions. 33. Theories. Austrian theories. Main article: Austrian business cycle theory. Austrian school economists Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek discussed the business cycle starting with Mises' theory of money and credit, published in 1912. Marxist theories. Main article: Crisis, Marxian. Recurrent major depressions in the world economy at a pace of 20 and 50 years have been the subject of studies since Jean-Charles Leonard de Sismondi, 1773–1842, provided the first theory of crisis in a critique of classical political economy's assumption of equilibrium between supply and demand. Developing an economic crisis theory became the central recurring concept throughout Karl Marx's mature work. Marx's law of the tendency for the rate of profit to fall borrowed many features of the presentation of John Stuart Mill's discussion of the tendency of profits to a minimum, Principles of Political Economy Book 4 Chapter 4. The theory is a corollary of the tendency towards the centralization of profits. In a capitalist system, successfully operating businesses return less money to their workers, in the form of wages, than the value of the goods produced by those workers, that is the amount of money the products are sold for. This profit first goes towards covering the initial investment in the business. In the long run, however, when one considers the combined economic activity of all successfully operating business, it is clear that less money, in the form of wages, is being returned to the mass of the population, the workers, than is available to them to buy all of these goods being produced. Furthermore, the expansion of businesses in the process of competing for markets leads to an abundance of goods and a general fall in their prices, further exacerbating the tendency for the rate of profit to fall. The viability of this theory depends upon two main factors. Firstly, the degree to which profit is taxed by government and returned to the mass of people in the form of welfare, family benefits and health and education spending, and secondly, the proportion of the population who are workers rather than investors, business owners. Given the extraordinary capital expenditure required to enter modern economic sectors like airline transport, the military industry, or chemical production, these sectors are extremely difficult for new businesses to enter and are being concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. Empirical and econometric research continues especially in the world systems theory and in the debate about Nikolai Kondratev and the so-called 50 years Kondratev waves. Major figures of world systems theory, like Andre Gunder Frank and Immanuel Wallerstein, consistently warned about the crash that the world economy is now facing. Citation needed. World systems scholars and Kondratev cycle researchers always implied that Washington consensus-oriented economists never understood the dangers and perils, which leading industrial nations will be facing and are now facing at the end of the long economic cycle which began after the oil crisis of 1973. Minsky's theory. Hyman Minsky has proposed a post-Keynesian explanation that is most applicable to a closed economy. He theorized that financial fragility is a typical feature of any capitalist economy. High fragility leads to a higher risk of a financial crisis. To facilitate his analysis, Minsky defines three approaches to financing firms may choose, according to their tolerance of risk. They are hedge finance, speculative finance, and Ponzi finance. Ponzi finance leads to the most fragility. For hedge finance, income flows are expected to meet financial obligations in every period, including both the principal and the interest on loans. For speculative finance, a firm must roll over debt because income flows are expected to only cover interest costs. None of the principal is paid off. For Ponzi finance, expected income flows will not even cover interest cost, so the firm must borrow more or sell off assets simply to service its debt. The hope is that either the market value of assets or income will rise enough to pay off interest and principal. Financial fragility levels move together with the business cycle. After a recession, firms have lost much financing and choose only hedge, the safest. As the economy grows and expected profits rise, firms tend to believe that they can allow themselves to take on speculative financing. In this case, they know that profits will not cover all the interest all the time. Firms, however, believe that profits will rise and the loans will eventually be repaid without much trouble. More loans lead to more investment, and the economy grows further. Then lenders also start believing that they will get back all the money they lend. Therefore, they are ready to lend to firms without full guarantees of success. Lenders know that such firms will have problems repaying. Still, they believe these firms will refinance from elsewhere as their expected profits rise. This is Ponzi financing. In this way, the economy has taken on much risky credit. Now it is only a question of time before some big firm actually defaults. Lenders understand the actual risks in the economy and stop giving credit so easily. Refinancing becomes impossible for many, and more firms default. If no new money comes into the economy to allow the refinancing process, a real economic crisis begins. During the recession, firms start to hedge again, and the cycle is closed. Coordination games. Main article: Coordination game. Mathematical approaches to modeling financial crises have emphasized that there is often positive feedback. 34, between market participants' decisions, see strategic complementarity. 35, positive feedback implies that there may be dramatic changes in asset values in response to small changes in economic fundamentals. For example, some models of currency crises, including that of Paul Krugman, imply that a fixed exchange rate may be stable for a long period of time, but will collapse suddenly in an avalanche of currency sales in response to a sufficient deterioration of government finances or underlying economic conditions. 36-37. According to some theories, positive feedback implies that the economy can have more than one equilibrium. There may be an equilibrium in which market participants invest heavily in asset markets because they expect assets to be valuable. This is the type of argument underlying Diamond and Dybvig's model of bank runs, in which savers withdraw their assets from the bank because they expect others to withdraw too. 17. Likewise, in Obstfeld's model of currency crises, when economic conditions are neither too bad nor too good, there are two possible outcomes. Speculators may or may not decide to attack the currency depending on what they expect other speculators to do. 18. Herding models and learning models. Main articles: Herd behavior and adaptive expectations. A variety of models have been developed in which asset values may spiral excessively up or down as investors learn from each other. In these models, asset purchases by a few agents encourage others to buy too, not because the true value of the asset increases when many buy, which is called strategic complementarity, but because investors come to believe the true asset value is high when they observe others buying. In herding models, it is assumed that investors are fully rational, but only have partial information about the economy. In these models, when a few investors buy some type of asset, this reveals that they have some positive information about that asset, which increases the rational incentive of others to buy the asset too. Even though this is a fully rational decision, it may sometimes lead to mistakenly high asset values, implying, eventually, a crash, since the first investors may, by chance, have been mistaken. 38, 39, 40, 41, 42. Herding models, based on complexity science, indicate that it is the internal structure of the market, not external influences, which is primarily responsible for crashes. 43-44. In adaptive learning or adaptive expectations models, investors are assumed to be imperfectly rational, basing their reasoning only on recent experience. In such models, if the price of a given asset rises for some period of time, investors may begin to believe that its price always rises, which increases their tendency to buy and thus drives the price up further. Likewise, observing a few price decreases may give rise to a downward price spiral, so in models of this type large fluctuations in asset prices may occur. Agent-based models of financial markets often assume investors act on the basis of adaptive learning or adaptive expectations. History. See also, List of banking crises and List of economic crises. The bursting of the South Sea Bubble and Mississippi Bubble in 1720 is regarded as the first modern financial crisis. A noted survey of financial crises is This Time is Different, 8 Centuries of Financial Folly, Reinhardt and Rogoff 2009, by economists Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff, who are regarded as among the foremost historians of financial crises. 45. In this survey, they trace the history of financial crisis back to sovereign defaults, default on public debt, which were the form of crisis prior to the 18th century and continue, then and now causing private bank failures. Crises since the 18th century feature both public debt default and private debt default. Reinhardt and Rogoff also class debasement of currency and hyperinflation as being forms of financial crisis, broadly speaking, because they lead to unilateral reduction, repudiation, of debt. Prior to 19th century, the Roman denarius was debased over time. Philip II of Spain defaulted 4 times on Spain's debt. Reinhardt and Rogoff trace inflation, to reduce debt, to Dionysius of Syracuse, of the 4th century BC, and begin their 8 centuries in 1258. Debasement of currency also occurred under the Roman Empire and Byzantine Empire. Among the earliest crises Reinhardt and Rogoff study is the 1340 default of England, due to setbacks in its war with France, the 100 Years' War, see details. Further early sovereign defaults include 7 defaults by Imperial Spain, 4 under Philip II, 3 under his successors. Other global and national financial mania since the 17th century include 1637, bursting of tulip mania in the Netherlands. While tulip mania is popularly reported as an example of a financial crisis, and was a speculative bubble, modern scholarship holds that its broader economic impact was limited to negligible, and that it did not precipitate a financial crisis. 1720, bursting of South Sea Bubble, Great Britain, and Mississippi Bubble, France, earliest of modern financial crises. In both cases the company assumed the national debt of the country, 80 to 85% in Great Britain, 100% in France, and thereupon the bubble burst. The resulting crisis of confidence probably had a deep impact on the financial and political development of France. 46. Crisis of 1763, started in Amsterdam, begun by the collapse of Johann Ernst Gotskowski and Leendert Peter de Neufville's bank, spread to Germany and Scandinavia. Crisis of 1772, in London and Amsterdam. 20 important banks in London went bankrupt after one banking house defaulted, bankers Neil, James, Fordyce and Down. France's financial and debt crisis, 1783 to 1788. France's severe financial crisis due to the immense debt accrued through the French involvement in the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, and the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783. Panic of 1792, run on banks in U.S. precipitated by the expansion of credit by the newly formed Bank of the United States. Panic of 1796 to 1797, British and U.S. credit crisis caused by land speculation bubble. 19th century. Danish state bankruptcy of 1813. Financial crisis of 1818, in England caused banks to call in loans and curtail new lending, draining specie out of the U.S. Panic of 1819, pervasive USA economic recession with bank failures, culmination of U.S.'s first boom-to-bust economic cycle. Panic of 1825, pervasive British economic recession in which many British banks failed, and Bank of England nearly failed. Panic of 1837, pervasive USA economic recession with bank failures, a 5-year depression ensued. Panic of 1847, a collapse of British financial markets associated with the end of the 1840s railway boom. Also see Bank Charter Act of 1844. Panic of 1857, pervasive USA economic recession with bank failures. Panic of 1866, the Over and Gurney crisis, primarily British. Black Friday, 1869, aka Gold Panic of 1869. Panic of 1873, pervasive USA economic recession with bank failures, known then as the 5-year Great Depression and now as the Long Depression. Panic of 1884, a panic in the United States centered on New York banks. Panic of 1890, aka Baring Crisis, near failure of a major London bank led to corresponding South American financial crises. Panic of 1893, a panic in the United States marked by the collapse of railroad overbuilding and shaky railroad financing which set off a series of bank failures. Australian banking crisis of 1893. Panic of 1896, an acute economic depression in the United States precipitated by a drop in silver reserves and market concerns on the effects it would have on the gold standard. 20th century. Panic of 1901, limited to crashing of the New York Stock Exchange. Panic of 1907, pervasive USA economic recession with bank failures. Panic of 1910 to 1911. 1910, Shanghai rubber stock market crisis. Wall Street crash of 1929, followed by the Great Depression, the largest and most important economic depression in the 20th century. 1973 to 1973 oil crisis, oil prices soared, causing the 1973 to 1974 stock market crash. Secondary banking crisis of 1973 to 1975, United Kingdom. Wall Street on the morning of 14th of May during the Panic of 1884. 1980s, Latin American debt crisis, beginning in Mexico in 1982 with the Mexican weekend. Bank stock crisis, Israel 1983. 1987, Black Monday, 1987, the largest one-day percentage decline in stock market history. 1988 to 92 Norwegian banking crisis. 1989 to 91, United States savings and loan crisis. 1990, Japanese asset price bubble collapsed. Early 1990s, Scandinavian banking crisis, Swedish banking crisis, Finnish banking crisis of 1990s. Early 1990s recession. 1992 to 93, Black Wednesday, speculative attacks on currencies in the European exchange rate mechanism. 1994 to 95, Mexico economic crisis in Mexico, speculative attack and default on Mexican debt. 1997 to 98 to 1997 Asian financial crisis, devaluations and banking crises across Asia. 1998, Russian financial crisis. 21st century. 2000 to 2001, Turkey 2001 Turkish economic crisis. 2000, early 2000s recession. 1999 to 2002, Argentine economic crisis, 1999 to 2002. 2001, bursting of dot-com bubble, speculations concerning internet companies crashed. 2008 to 2011, Icelandic financial crisis. 2007 to 08, financial crisis of 2007 to 2008. 2008 to 2014 Spain 2008 to 2014 Spanish financial crisis. 2010 European sovereign debt crisis. 2014 Russian financial crisis. 2010 to 2018 Greek government debt crisis. 2018 present Turkish currency and debt crisis. 2018. 2020 present 2020 stock market crash, especially the Black Monday and the Black Thursday. See also: Icon Money Portal, Icon Banks Portal, Bailout, Bank Run, Credit Crunch, Financial Stability, Flight to Liquidity, Global Debt Levels, Quantitative Waves, Lender of Last Resort, Liquidity Crisis, Macroprudential Policy, Nikolai Kondrativ, Real Estate Bubble, Specific, 2000s Energy Crisis, 2007 to 2008 World Food Price Crisis, Great Depression, Subprime Mortgage Crisis, America's Great Depression, Great Trade Collapse, Literature, General Perspectives, Walter Bagehot, 1873, Lombard Street, A Description of the Money Market, Charles P. Kindleberger and Robert Taliber, 2005, Manias, Panics, and Crashes, A History of Financial Crises, Palgrave Macmillan, 2005 ISBN 978-14039 3651-6. Gernot Kohler and Emilio Jose Chaves, editors, Globalization, Critical Perspectives Hauptwaj New York, Nova Science Publishers ISBN 159033346-2. With contributions by Samir Amin, Christopher Chase Dunn, Andre Gunder Frank, Emmanuel Wallerstein. Hyman P. Minsky, 1986, 2008, Stabilizing an Unstable Economy. Reinhardt, Carmen, Rogoff, Kenneth, 2009. This Time is Different, 8 Centuries of Financial Folly. Princeton University Press. p. 496. ISBN 978-0691-14216-6. Ferguson, Neil, 2009. The Ascent of Money, A Financial History of the World. Penguin. Pages 448. ISBN 978-014-311-617-2. Joachim Vutt, 2014, Fear, Folly, and Financial Crises, Some Policy Lessons from History, UBS Center Public Papers, Issue 2, UBS International Center of Economics in Society, Zurich. Banking Crises. Franklin Allen and Douglas Gale, 2000, Financial Contagion, Journal of Political Economy 108, 1, pages 1 to 33. Franklin Allen and Douglas Gale, 2007, Understanding Financial Crises. Charles W. Calabrese and Stephen H. Haber, 2014, Fragile by Design, The Political Origins of Banking Crises and Scarce Credit, Princeton, New Jersey, Princeton University Press. Jean-Charles Rochet, 2008, Why Are There So Many Banking Crises? The Politics and Policy of Bank Regulation. R. Glenn Hubbard, ed., 1991, Financial Markets and Financial Crises. Douglas Diamond and Philip Dybvig, 1983, Bank Runs, Deposit Insurance, and Liquidity. Journal of Political Economy 91, 3. Lukoven and Fabian Valencia, 2008, Systemic Banking Crises, A New Database. International Monetary Fund Working Paper 08-224. Thomas Merwa, 2012, States, Banks and Crisis, Emerging Finance Capitalism in Mexico and Turkey, Edward Elgar Publishing Limited, Cheltenham, UK. Bubbles and Crashes. Dutton, Roy, 2010, Financial Meltdown 2010, hardback. Infodeal. ISBN 978-09556554-32. Charles Mackay, 1841, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. Didier Sornet, 2003, Why Stock Markets Crash, Princeton University Press. Robert J. Schiller, 1999, 2006, Irrational Exuberance. Marcus Brunner Meyer, 2008, Bubbles, New Palgrave Dictionary of Economics, 2nd ed. Douglas French, 2009, Early Speculative Bubbles and Increases in the Supply of Money. Marcus K. Brunner Meyer, 2001, Asset Pricing Under Asymmetric Information, Bubbles, Crashes, Technical Analysis, and Herding, Oxford University Press. ISBN 0-19-829698-3. Harmon D., Logie M., De Aguirre Mam., Chinalato D.D., Braha D., Epstein I.R., Bar Yam Y. 2015, Anticipating Economic Market Crises Using Measures of Collective Panic. PLOS 110-7. 43. International Financial Crises. Acocella, N. Di Bartolomeo, G. and Hughes Hallett, A. 2012, Central Banks and Economic Policy After the Crisis, What Have We Learned? Ch. 5 in, Baker, H.K. and Riddick, L.A., eds., Survey of International Finance, Oxford University Press. Paul Krugman, 1995, Currencies and Crises. Craig Burnside, Martin Eichenbaum, and Sergio Rabello, 2008, Currency Crisis Models, New Palgrave Dictionary of Economics, 2nd ed. Morris Obstfeld, 1996, Models of Currency Crises with Self-Fulfilling Futures. European Economic Review 40. Stephen Morris and Hyen Song Shin, 1998, Unique Equilibrium in a Model of Self-Fulfilling Currency Attacks. American Economic Review 88, 3. Barry Eichengreen, 2004, Capital Flows and Crises. Charles Goodhart and P. Dale R.G., 1998, Financial Crises, plus a Change, plus Salamim Chose. International Finance 1, 2, pages 261-87. Jean Tirole, 2002, Financial Crises, Liquidity, and the International Monetary System. Guillermo Calvo, 2005, Emerging Capital Markets in Turmoil, Bad Luck or Bad Policy? Barry Eichengreen, 2002, Financial Crises, and What to Do About Them. Charles Callamreyes, 1998, Blueprints for a New Global Financial Architecture. The Great Depression and Earlier Banking Crises. Murray Rothbard, 1962, The Panic of 1819. Murray Rothbard, 1963, America's Great Depression. Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, 1971, A Monetary History of the United States. Ben S. Bernanke, 2000, Essays on the Great Depression. Robert F. Bruner, 2007, The Panic of 1907. Lessons Learned from the Market's Perfect Storm. Recent International Financial Crises. Barry Eichengreen and Peter Lindert, eds., 1992, The International Debt Crisis in Historical Perspective. Lessons from the Asian Financial Crisis, edited by Richard Carney. New York, Routledge, 2009. ISBN 978-0415-48198, hardback, ISBN 0415-48192, hardback, ISBN 978-0203-88477-5, ebook, ISBN 0203-88477-9, ebook. Robertson, Justin, 1972 U.S.-Asia Economic Relations, A Political Economy of Crisis and the Rise of New Business Actors, Justin Robertson. Abingdon, Uxon, New York, New York, Routledge, 2008. ISBN 978-0415-46951-7, HPK, ISBN 978-0203-89052-3, ebook. 2007 to 2012 Financial Crisis. Robert J. Schiller, 2008, The Subprime Solution, How Today's Global Financial Crisis Happened, and What to Do About It. ISBN 0691-13929-6. J.C. Coffey, What Went Wrong? An Initial Inquiry into the Causes of the 2008 Financial Crisis, 2009, 9-1 Journal of Corporate Law Studies 1. Martian, Francesco, Frasci, Michelle U. April 10, 2009. The Role of Banks in the Subprime Financial Crisis. SSRN 1383473. Marcus Brunner Meyer, 2009, Deciphering the Liquidity and Credit Crunch 2007 to 2008. Journal of Economic Perspectives 23, 1, pages 77 to 100. Paul Krugman, 2008, The Return of Depression Economics and the Crisis of 2008. ISBN 0393071014. The Myths About the Economic Crisis, The Reformist Left and Economic Democracy by Takis Fotopoulos, The International Journal of Inclusive Democracy, Volume 4, No. 4, October 2008. United States Congress. House Committee on the Judiciary. Subcommittee on Commercial and Administrative Law. Working Families in Financial Crisis, Medical Debt and Bankruptcy, hearing before the Subcommittee on Commercial and Administrative Law of the Committee on the Judiciary, House of Representatives, 110th Congress, First Session, July 17, 2007. Washington, USGPO, for sale by the Superintendent of Docks, USGPO, 2008. 277 p. ISBN 978-01608-13764 ISBN 0160813766, 2. Williams, Mark T. March 2010. Uncontrolled Risk, The Lessons of Lehman Brothers and How Systemic Risk Can Still Bring Down the World Financial System. McGraw-Hill. ISBN 9780741749046. Tkac, Paula A., Dwyer, Gerald P. August 2009. The Financial Crisis of 2008 in Fixed Income Markets. SSRN 1464891. Harmon D., Logie M., De Aguirre Mam., Chinalato D.D., Braha D., Epstein I.R., Bar Yam Y. 2015. Anticipating Economic Market Crises Using Measures of Collective Panic. PLOS 110-7. 43. References.